Christian Gadfly here. If you like to see videos where somebody dunks on Islam, this is the channel for you. Go ahead and subscribe, hit the notification bell. I'm going to be attacking a video made by a friend of mine, Holy Koolaid, and this is an atheist video. I don't usually attack atheist videos as much, but this particular one I'm going to attack because, well, first of all, he's arguing that the Bible's been corrupted, and all the Muslims are always claiming this. Secondly, I'm able to debunk him using an interview I did with a 92-year-old Grannie who I really love and enjoy. So, Grannie, if you see this video, it's for you. That's my girl.
About that at the end of the video. The Bible, unquestionably the most influential book of all time, has been used to inspire great acts of charity, kindness, and magnificent works of art, and to justify horrific wars and atrocities.
This made me giggle because it kind of reminds me of me when I was an atheist. This feels like a relic of the past where they have this myth that history would be a perfect secular utopia if it hadn't been for religion. It's just a bunch of crap. It's just not true at all. Here's a clip from an atheist historian, Tom Holland.
But you honestly think that actually people simply haven't appreciated just how much we owe to the Judeo-Christian?
I think. I mean, if we're talking of Paul, I think of him as a kind of depth charge, deep beneath the foundations of the classical world, and it's not anything that you particularly notice if you're in Corinth or Alexandria, and then you start feeling this kind of rippling outwards, and by the time you get to the 11th century. In Latin Christendom, everything has changed.
Even this idea that war is bad, it's just something that Holy Koolaid's taking because he's in a Christian culture. He doesn't even realize it. Tom Holland here is going to describe how Caesar campaigned using all of the war that he did. War was awesome in most cultures. The idea of protecting the weak and trying to reduce suffering is very Christian, despite whatever crap Sam Harris is saying, or Richard Dawkins. I think Richard Dawkins is finally starting to realize. He's like, well, I'm a cultural Christian, after spending his whole life destroying it.
I call myself a cultural Christian.
Most overrated atheist in the history of atheism.
Cicero's great contemporary Caesar is, by some accounts, slaughtering 1 million Gauls and enslaving another 1 million in the cause of boosting his political career. And far from feeling in any way embarrassed about this, he's kind of promoting it. And so when he holds his triumph, people are going through the streets of Rome carrying billboards, boasting about how many people he's killed. And this is a really terrifyingly alien world. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that it is built on systematic exploitation. Mm-hmm. So the entire economy is founded on slave labor.
Right.
The sexual economy is founded on the absolute right of free Roman males to have sex with anyone that they want, any way that they like. And in almost every way, this is a world that is unspeakably cruel to our way of thinking. And so this worried me more and more, and it was kind of like I was thinking, well, I'm clearly not, as I'd vaguely imagined, the heir of the Greeks and the Romans in any way, really. And so where am I coming from? And it was like a kind of itch, you get on your back and you can't find it. And this was then enhanced for me by then writing a book about late antiquity and the emergence of Islam from the late religious the religious and imperial context of late antiquity, and again finding in Islam a profound quality of the alien. That there were aspects of Islam that were very familiar, but there were many aspects of it that again seemed deeply, deeply alien. And I began to realize that actually, in almost every way, I am Christian.
So any of these ideas like war crimes and human rights and the altruism's good. Remember when Holy Koolaid was showing the people giving to the poor? That's all totally Christian. Just read some Nietzsche. Read some John Gray. Read Alex Rosenberg. You'll realize this is just Christian. And those are all atheist authors I just mentioned.
Nearly 2,000 years after the last book of the Bible was penned, billions still turn to it for insight, many of them holding to the belief in its divine inspiration, preservation, and unchanging inerrancy. But does the Bible that you read today contain the same preserved content, or at least the same general message penned by its authors all of those generations ago?
Yes. Yes, it has the same message. All the manuscript evidence is pointing to it. Most of the quotes that he's going to use later in his video, if you read more of the context, they all point to it. His arguments against it are things like canons being different or there being different types of Christianity. None of those things have any relevance at all to whether the scriptures have been corrupted or not. And nowhere, anywhere in any of the textual traditions is there anything about any of these people being Muslims. Kinds of things.
Just how much, if at all, has the Bible changed? I want to begin by focusing predominantly on the New Testament, because we have significantly more information on how it came together. The events recounted in the New Testament take place in the 1st century CE or AD, and largely deal with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, as well as the history of the early church. The first gospel is believed to have been penned around 35 years after Jesus died. But before a single word was written, the stories about Jesus were passed around by word of mouth, by followers fleeing persecution, attempting to spread a story by any means necessary. Now remember, Jesus was killed for insurrection.
Any means necessary. Okay, so what is it that's important to these people? The spreading of the message or the contents of the message? Because he's implying that the contents of the message aren't important because they wanted to spread it everywhere. Why do they want to spread it everywhere if they don't believe in it anyway? So it'd be like, okay, let's say that I want to spread the message that Cheetos are really, really good, and I want to spread it no matter what. Why would I change that message if that message is the reason that I'm trying to spread the message? It's a self-refuting model. His model does not make any sense. And he says that there's all this persecution. Persecution in the ancient world wasn't necessarily as bad. It's not like you're either Nazi Germany or nothing at all, right? So Paul's able to travel around. He's able to speak in different places. Sometimes the Jews go after him. Sometimes the idol makers in Ephesus go after him. But it's not like he's metaphysically and logically incapable of writing down his ideas. And you got to pick a lane. Are they changing their message no matter what, or are they being persecuted? Because they're not going to be persecuted if they're just changing their message however they want, because they would just change the message to be a message where they're not going to be persecuted anymore. This is a dumb model.
Accused of attempting to establish his own kingdom in the heart of the Roman Empire. It's no wonder that his followers face persecution and censorship.
He's talking about post-resurrection. So from the Roman point of view, Jesus is dead. We better stop these guys before they choose Jesus as king instead of Caesar. Well, who's Jesus? Oh, he's dead. Why would they be attacking him just because? That doesn't make any sense at all. As to why the Romans were attacking the Christians, there's not really one answer. It depends on what decade you're in and what Roman you're talking about. So, for example, if you're talking about Nero, he's accused of burning down Rome, and to get rid of the accusation, he uses the Christians as a scapegoat. It's from Tacitus. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators. Obviously, they're not insurrectionists. They're talking about how Christus is dead. Pontius Pilate and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. That's around 64 AD. Pliny the Younger, writing within 100 years, around 111 to 113, talks about why he tortured Christians to death. He says, I've observed the following procedure. I interrogated them as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserves to be punished. So that's not insurrection either. He's just killing them because they won't stop saying that they're Christians. That's the only reason. So he says they're changing the message to make it more accepted, but then actual evidence from history has them refusing to change their message and being killed for it. They didn't see them as insurrectionists because Jesus was dead. But you can actually see in all four Gospels where Pilate is reluctant to kill Jesus. And he doesn't want to, and this is true even later with Paul in Acts. That's something else in this video is he kind of conflates everything between 30 AD and like 300 AD as though it's all one time period. And so he'll even talk about like later Gnostic sects that don't pop up until the mid-2nd century and act like that's part of what's going on in the 1st century. It's all kind of conflated together into a mess. I mean, even Anne Frank was able to write a diary, right? And Bonhoeffer was also in Nazi Germany. He wrote several books. And so just because you're persecuted doesn't mean you're incapable of writing.
As well. And as his followers scattered, they told and retold stories in new locations to new audiences, often with no first-hand witnesses present to fact-check them on their stories.
This is false. If you just read in Acts, you can see all these places where the early church will do things like send Barnabas with Saul whenever they go to Antioch to make sure that the correct message is being preached. There's this whole like inner circle of people who are really close to the apostles, who are all in Jerusalem, who are, well, sometimes they also travel around. This here, I think, addresses some of these issues. We're going to play a little bit from an interview that I had with, this is a 92-year-old granny whose father fought in World War I. And this is a bilingual granny.
¿Cuál es tu color favorito?
Rojo.
Rojo. Dígame sobre el rojo.
Rojo es el color de las mujeres dominantes.
And these are events that are over 100 years old.
He was born in the forest in the south of England. And at 18 years old, he volunteered to go to World War I. And he was trained in Malta. He had 5 brothers and 1 sister. And all his brothers above him left, also to the war. And he was assigned to the artillery, and he had to calibrate the guns going to the enemy. And one night, his fellow in the trenches said, "I'm not going to die in the war." And so he says, "How do you know that?" And he says, "Because I have a promise on the Bible." And he showed him the promise. And so he preached the word to my father, and he accepted Jesus Christ in the trenches of that, on the Flanders or France, whatever. And then he was wounded in the war. He had scrap metal all over one side of his. He was in the hospital, in the camp, or in the war for 6 months, and then he was transferred to London. There were no jobs in London, so he used to sell apples in the street. Then he received a call to be a missionary. He went to Villarrica in Paraguay. My mother was from a rich Paraguayan family. Her job was teaching Spanish or Guarani, the native language. And so she said, my father, he'll never learn Spanish or English because he's a tough guy. And so, but he learned both languages fluently.
All right, so if we can trust anything Granny says, if what she just said is true, then all of Holy Koolaid's video is garbage. We're going to go through and see. She's telling the truth, right? Look, she's not an eyewitness. Holy Koolaid's going to be like, well, if someone's not an eyewitness, you can't trust their testimony. Obviously, that's not true. She's telling the truth. She's talking about her father. She's probably a pretty good source to learn about the life of her father. The events we're learning about here are from 100 years after they happened. In fact, in every kind of criteria of history you can use, the Gospels and the story of Jesus' death and resurrection is superior to Granny's testimony because the Gospels have multiple attestation from multiple witnesses. The gap of time is way less for the Gospels than for Granny. And it's a statement against interest where everywhere they're sending this message, they're being killed for it. Granny doesn't have any of that, and still we believe her. And so if we can believe her, why not the Gospels, which are even that much more credible?
Whether or not Jesus actually performed miracles or resurrected from the dead isn't really the purview of this video. But regardless, just like Christians today,
to Holy Koolaid's credit, it's really good of him and insightful to see the difference between these and to communicate clearly that he's going on historical concerns and he's not really focusing on the philosophical aspect. So he says there that it's not, he's not talking about the resurrection, which is fine. I wish he would clearly say the purview of this video is an argument that, and then a clear thesis statement. Like, we can't know the general message of the scriptures.
Attempting to gain followers, save people from hell, or grow their communities, the early church certainly had an incentive to exaggerate, and we know how easily
Anyone who cares what anyone is thinking about what they say has an incentive to exaggerate. I have an incentive to exaggerate every day when I'm reporting something to my boss or talking to my children or talking to my wife. That doesn't mean I actually exaggerate, right? I've had incentive to kill somebody before. It doesn't mean I'm going to kill them. If you applied this without bias, you just applied it everywhere, you would have to throw out everything everyone says. Every human has incentive to exaggerate on every single claim that they make. And in fact, you could counter this and say there's an incentive not to exaggerate because, if you distort this message, you could be punished eternally. Or if you distort this message, you could be detracting glory from Jesus and he's king and God. Not a great argument.
Stories change from one retelling to the next, though there's no...
I was going to say, too, even Holy Koolaid has an incentive to exaggerate, which I think he does in this video. And I'm not saying he's a liar. He's not a liar. He's a good person. But he has a whole audience of people who they get a dopamine hit. They feel endorphins whenever they dunk on religion because it makes them feel smarter. And a lot of them are ex-fundamentalists who feel betrayed by their past. And to have somebody boxing fundamentalism for them feels good. It feels euphoric. So... there's everyone who speaks has a motive to exaggerate.
Way to know for sure just how much the stories of the Bible evolved during this oral stage of its development. It's undeniable.
So he said there's no way of knowing how much the Bible evolved during this oral stage of its development. Another way of saying this is to say we have no evidence that it evolved during this stage of development. Notice what he's doing with the evidence here. Where there's no evidence, he just says, oh, it means it must have evolved a bunch and we just don't have evidence of it. But there is no evidence. If you want to show that it evolved during this time period, cite some evidence, right? There isn't any. And then he also seems to act like this period of 35 years or 30 years, he acts like this period of 30 years is just this insurmountable amount of time. I have memories from my own life that are 30 years old. Like I remember playing with a toy called Mighty Max. Do I just have to throw out all those memories because they're over 30 years and they've developed too much into legends since then? And we looked at Grannie. I think we're getting accurate data that's over 100 years old. There's no reason to throw out what she's saying. So why would we think that things develop a totally insane amount in a 30-year period when we can have an accurate story from Grannie from 100 years later?
Undeniable that this period of transmission was highly volatile. And when the
there's no evidence of that.
first gospel was eventually written down, it almost certainly wasn't penned by an eyewitness. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John aren't on any of our oldest manuscripts.
That's not true. All right, so you can see here, this is Evangelion kata Ioannein means gospel according to John. Kata Ioannein. You can't see it very well there, but it's there. I also have P75. I found this in the Vatican Library. I might have a link to it in the video description. At the end of the Gospel of Luke, it says kata Lucan, and then Evangelion kata Ioannein. Clear as day right there. P75. This is super old. This is like 2nd century. Kata Lucan means according to Luke, and Evangelion kata Ioannein means the gospel according to John. And the reason it's in that order in P75 is because it's right at the end of the Gospel of Luke. It says according to Luke at the end. Presumably it had at the beginning too, but it's cut off in the manuscript. And then it goes into according to John. And this is interesting because this is on the same page, and it shows us that the Gospels were at least partially in the same order that we still have them today, where John followed Luke, even really, really early at the late 2nd century. And it's one of our most reliable manuscripts. It's from the Alexandrian text type. It's really, really close to Vaticanus. And there you see it, the names of 2 of our Gospels. One of our early manuscripts is called Papyrus 4, and accompanying Papyrus 4 is one small fragment that reads, Evangelion kata Matthaion, Gospel according to Matthew. This leaf could have been the title sheet to the Matthew portion of the Codex P4, P64, P67. The handwriting, however, is not that of the scribe, but of another writer. The title sheet was very likely produced before AD 200, so that is 2nd century. So there you go. Plenty of early manuscript evidence that the Gospels had these titles already in the 2nd century, which is just a couple decades later. There's not a single example in all of our manuscript evidence of a name being put onto one of these Gospels that's different from the traditional name. And so if this is just made up in the 2nd century, you have to explain why everyone in the world made up the same names for the same Gospels.
But the Gospels were later attributed to them to lend them credibility, and almost all Christian and secular experts agree that we have no idea who actually wrote them.
It's not virtually all. It's just a majority doubt historical authorship ascriptions. But also, a majority believe that the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts.
And at the very minimum, most scholars today, the majority of scholars, do think that at minimum, Mark and John contain eyewitness testimony, that Mark was reporting what he had heard Peter speak, and that John, most scholars don't think that John was written by John, the son of Zebedee, today. I do, but most scholars don't. But they will at least say that John was either written by a minor disciple of Jesus, or whoever wrote John, one of Jesus' disciples, perhaps John, the son of Zebedee, was that author's primary source for the information that he has.
Just off the top of my head, I could think of Douglas Moo, D.A. Carson, Craig Keener, Gundry, Guthrie, a bunch of people who would just give all 4 of the Gospels the traditional authorship. And Keener's a really good example because, like me, he doubts Matthew the most out of all of them. And just looking at the scholarly consensus was enough to convince him that Matthew wasn't actually authored by Matthew. But he's since changed his mind on this. In contrast to my earlier opinion, and as a result of reevaluating the earliest patristic materials that depend most heavily on apostolic Christianity, I'm inclined to give more weight to the voice of early Christian tradition than I did previously. And, you know, these patristic fathers had way more resources than we have. Papias had 5 volumes that are missing. Hegesippus' writings are all gone. And so these people who are making these authorial ascriptions knew way more and had way more data than we do today.
The author of Luke admits that he's not getting his information firsthand.
Well, okay, no, that's... Oh, gosh, that's so stupid. The reason we know Luke wasn't an eyewitness is because he tells us he used eyewitnesses. Okay, so many wanted to draw up an account, just as they handed down to us, peredosan hemin, hoiarches from the beginning, those ones, the autoptai kai huperetai. Autoptai, this is a mix of auto and optos. Auto means like of the self, like think automated. Optos is like vision, so like optical in English. Autoptai means an eyewitness. So he's giving, just as he received it, just as we received it from the beginning, eyewitnesses. So does Luke admit he's not an eyewitness? Yes. How does he do this? By telling us that he used eyewitnesses and that he used huperitai, which according to N.T. Wright, quoting Bailey, is what he says, the assumption that the early Christians were not interested in history becomes untenable. To remember the works and deeds of Jesus of Nazareth was to affirm their own unique identity. The stories had to be told and controlled, or everything that made them who they were was lost, right? So compare this to Holy Koolaid's model. This, Bailey argues, is the process presupposed by the phrase eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Luke 1:2, huperitai is an official, and Luke 4:20, a synagogue official in charge of the scrolls. But an early Christian community without buildings and formal institutional structures, most likely an accredited witness to vital traditions. Okay, so, Luke is an eyewitness because he interviewed eyewitnesses. Even about this intro, Bart Ehrman says the following, quote, there is no reason to suspect that Luke is lying here. He knew of many earlier authors who had compiled narratives about the subject matter that he himself is about to narrate the life of Jesus. Bart Ehrman, Did Jesus Exist? Page 79. And so this is interesting, right? What Holy Koolaid is taking to be evidence against the Bible is actually really good evidence for it. Luke's admission he's not an eyewitness is him saying, I'm basing what I write off of eyewitnesses. So what does that teach us about these other anonymous Gospels like Mark and Matthew? Well, Luke is quoting these same sources, right? The synoptic problem is complex, but most people believe Luke was quoting Mark. and then that Mark and Matthew are both quoting a document called Q. So what can we know about Q and Mark? They're eyewitnesses, right? At least there's evidence that they are eyewitnesses. In history, it's all probabilities. Whatever theory you have needs to be based on evidence. We have a source from the 1st century, Luke, who's telling us that he based his story on eyewitnesses. And he writes out his gospel, and then he is obviously quoting from 2 of our other sources, the Q material of Matthew, so that boosts the credibility of Matthew, and he's quoting from Mark, which boosts the credibility of Mark.
He and Matthew verbatim copy massive chunks of their text directly from Mark, who wasn't one of the 12 disciples.
The church has never alleged that Mark or Luke were disciples, and actually this is once again one of those arguments where he's using it but actually cuts against him way stronger. Why would someone make up that Mark wrote this? Why would someone make up that Luke wrote Luke? They're not one of the 12 disciples. No one was ever alleging they were one of the 12 disciples. But both of them have strong evidence that points to them using eyewitnesses. The historical church position isn't that he himself was an eyewitness, but that he was talking to eyewitnesses, namely Peter. I'm going to read from Eusebius where we get this. All right, Eusebius is telling us what Papias said, and Papias was talking to John the presbyter. So this goes back to the 1st century, this tradition. And this too, the presbyter used to say, Mark, who had been Peter's interpreter, wrote down carefully, but not in order, all that he remembered of the Lord's sayings and doings. This explains how he could speak Greek. He's the interpreter, right? This explains that he's bilingual. This explains why some chronology might not match up with the other Gospels, because he's not trying to do this in order, but not in order. He wrote down carefully, but not in order, all that he remembered of the Lord's sayings and doings. For he had not heard the Lord or been one of his followers, but later, as I said, one of Peter's. So he's one of Peter's followers. Peter used to adapt his teachings to the occasion without making a systematic arrangement of the Lord's sayings, so that Mark was quite justified in writing down some things just as he remembered them. For he had one purpose only, to leave out nothing that he had heard and to make no misstatement about it. That's what our sources say. That's what all the data matches. All right, this model makes way more sense than any other model out there.
Which is odd, because if the author of Matthew was Jesus' disciple Matthew, then why is he copying his information from other sources?
Yeah, if I ever wrote a story of the life of my dad, and my mom had already written a book over the life of my dad, especially if my mom had already passed away, I'm not just going to ignore her book, right? She knows things about my dad that I don't. She's closer to him. And so if Matthew, who wasn't one of the inner 3, Peter, James, and John, if he wants to write a gospel, and especially if Peter's already passed away, it makes total sense for him to use Mark. I think Matthew might have drafted multiple documents, because all the church fathers talk about this early Aramaic or Hebrew document called the Gospel of the Hebrews, but then they also apply the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew. They seem to say that he wrote both of these, which is totally possible. Even Josephus wrote Aramaic copies of his own books, though they don't survive to today, but I can give a citation for that right now. I'll be right back. Every known manuscript of the Gospel according to Matthew is written in Greek, yet Papias and Irenaeus report that Matthew wrote his Gospel first and that he wrote in Hebrew. As a result, many scholars believe the Apostle Matthew originally wrote Jesus' teachings in Aramaic, a language that's closely related to Hebrew. Later, someone, perhaps Matthew or someone associated with Matthew, merged these portions with portions of Mark's Gospel to form the Gospel according to Matthew as we know it, in the Greek language. Such practices were not unheard of in the 1st century. Flavius Josephus wrote 2 histories of the Jewish-Roman War, one in Aramaic and the other in Greek. As with Matthew's Gospel, the Aramaic version didn't circulate widely and thus has not survived. The Book of Tobit, found in Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles, was also thought for many years to have circulated only in Greek. Recently, fragments of separate Hebrew and Aramaic versions of this book have been discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there you go. It could have been written in both languages, especially if he's a tax collector. He's going to know how to speak Greek. Where they were located in the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, in between Sepphoris and the Decapolis, they almost certainly spoke Greek, in my opinion. I'm someone who lives near the southern border of the United States. There is a lot of bilingual people here who speak Spanish and English. For some reason, people who live in other areas of America, like in the academic towers on the East Coast, they just think humans are metaphysically and logically incapable of learning more than one language. For anyone who lives in a multicultural area, this is laughably stupid.
It's testimony. Oh, and Mark, who they're copying from, probably had never even been to the region where the events took place because he makes mistakes when writing about the local geography, lacks basic familiarity with Jewish customs, and he misquotes the Jewish scriptures.
This is all conclusory language. He just says these, he does this a lot in his videos where he'll just have a bunch of conclusions, but he has no source for me to go check. He doesn't even tell me a specific example of what it is that Mark is messing up so that I can look at it and, you know, assess whether it's true or not. So I have no way to comment on this. I don't, you know, I have no idea what he's talking about. I do want to plug this book, though, Mike Lacona's book. So I'm not sure what issues he's talking about in Mark, but if it's something like, you know, Jesus cursing the fig tree in Mark, and then they go to Jerusalem and they come back and it's dead on the way when they're coming back, versus in Matthew where he curses it and it dies right there. These are things common and conventional to Greco-Roman historiography. In this book, it's called Jesus Contradicted. He goes through literary devices that Greco-Roman historiographers used. He looks at an ancient textbook by an author named Theon, and he looks at how Plutarch used these. And so some of them are compression, displacement, transfer, conflation, simplification, literary spotlighting. So maybe these are the sorts of contradictions that he's talking about. Holy Koolaid, if you see this video, if that's what you're talking about, I would suggest this. It's a much better approach than like fundamentalism. Looking at the Gospels for what they actually are, Greco-Roman historiography. The only other two things I could think of off the top of my head are the misattribution of Abimelech and the controversy over Gerasenes versus Gadrasenes. Maybe he's talking about that. There's a really good article on the Gadarene controversy in the Archaeological Study Bible. And then as for Abimelech, worst case scenario, he just remembered a name wrong. That doesn't mean that he's not the author of the book. So I don't think, you know, and that's me making the case. I don't even know what he's talking about.
John is written later and has a way different message than the three synoptic gospels.
John does not have a way different message than the three synoptic gospels. Let's steel man him for a moment. A lot of scholars like Bart Ehrman say that the Gospels start off with low Christology like Mark, and then they have a higher Christology in John, where Jesus isn't really God in Mark, but then he's God by the time you get to John. And notice Holy Koolaid hasn't even alleged that, right? He's just saying they have different messages, but he doesn't say what they are. He doesn't cite any sources telling us why they're different messages. But we'll grant him this Christology one just so I can make a video addressing this. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus walks on water, which according to Job 9 is something only God can do. And then it says he was about to pass them by. And this is avar in Hebrew, and it's parelthein in Greek. God passes by Moses sitting on the mountain in Exodus, I think it's 32. 1 Kings 19, he passes by Elijah. It's the same word, parelthein, right? So, God does this passing by in Job. Oh, he walks on water in Job 9. And then Job 11, it says he walks by and I didn't notice him, right? So this is something that an anthropomorphic Yahweh does in the Old Testament over and over as he passes by. It's also something, and walking on water is also something that anthropomorphic Yahweh does in Job 9, verse 8. And so Mark, in writing his gospel, has Jesus walk on water and he's about to pass them by. And what does he say in the Greek? It says they're scared, and he doesn't reply with, don't be scared. He doesn't reply with, don't worry, it's me. They don't ask him who it is. They're just scared of him. They think it's a ghost. And all he says back is, I am. He's not answering a question. And it's sometimes hard to see in the English translation because it'll say something like, it is I. He doesn't say it is I. He says, I am, ego eimi, which is the divine name. So the author of Mark has his Jesus walking on water, trying to pass them by and saying, I am. And so these arguments about how the Christologies or theologies are different between the Gospels, I don't buy them. I do think that John is more of a spiritual paraphrase than the others. I think the others are more like your typical Greco-Roman historiography. I think John is more he's just like a more, I think of it kind of like a romantic. He's the kind of person who sits with a portrait and paints. And so it's not necessarily a less accurate depiction of Jesus. So I can think of like, imagine you have a friend of yours and you take a picture of them, and then if you're a really good artist, you paint a portrait of them. You might be able to give more of the personality of a person through the portrait, even though it's not a literal representation of the person. And I know this blows people's minds who are fundamentalists or ex-fundamentalist atheists, but actually sometimes art can be a better description of reality than some measurable and repeatable bit of reality itself, right? Sometimes you can have a more accurate communication of the real situation of something through a piece of art than you could through a video or something else that's just like a one-for-one transliteration of it. All right,
Gospels, and the author of John doesn't claim to be a disciple.
This passage here says the opposite of what he's saying. So he quotes this passage to say that John didn't write the Gospel of John, but read it. So it has this whole story, and then at verse 24, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. That doesn't tell us that the whole Gospel of John wasn't written by John. That's evidence that John wrote the Gospel, and then one of his followers after he died or at some other time wrote 24, 25, 26 to the end, and it's just like... it's just a conclusion to this document that's affirming the document. In these ancient documents, it's pretty common for the followers of someone to add on at the end as multiple witnesses in order to boost the credibility of something. Even in my own testimony video on my YouTube, I purposefully had a lifelong friend with me so that the internet knows I'm not just some random guy making things up. There's someone there who was there, who knows me, who knows the people who know me, and that people don't live their stories in isolation, and he was there to be able to say, yes, you're right about this, you're wrong about this. He fact checks me on my own testimony. And so having this is actually evidence that John wrote the gospel and not the other way around. And so you have a situation where all of the tradition is ascribing this gospel to John, and then John doesn't even name himself. And actually, this is evidence that he did write it. This argument, so saying that he didn't put his name in it, this argument, however, assumes that the only reason for anonymity was lack of renown, when in fact a wide variety of other possible reasons have been offered. Indeed, might the author not have more freedom to leave himself unnamed if he was known, especially if he were the author? Another scholar suggests that the author was a priest because Polycrates, an early bishop of Ephesus, claimed that the beloved disciple was a prominent priest. But Polycrates in the same text also calls that disciple John, and may have intended priest figuratively in accordance with the common early Christian usage. Given the honorable status this tradition claims for John, its isolation militates against its likelihood in any literal sense. And also, I originally, I left the faith because I saw Bible errors, and I was a logical positivist, and I was convinced by the new atheist arguments. When I came back in, I didn't think that the Bible was reliable, but I thought that Jesus did historically rise. I did not think John was the author of this book. And I haven't until recently switched again, where now I think John authored this thing. And my reasoning is because from Alexandria to Ephesus to Irenaeus in France, all the early manuscripts that do attribute it, they all give it to John. And I didn't notice this till I was reading John in Hebrew, not in Hebrew, in Greek. What's weird is you notice that he leaves the name of everyone in John of Zebedee's family anonymous. Why would a pseudographer who's pretending to be John not write his own name in it, first of all, and then put in the effort to figure out it? Some of it's hard to find, like to figure out that Salome is his mother. You have to read Mark and Matthew really closely and pay attention to who it is that's at the cross with Jesus. He leaves her anonymous. He leaves his brother and himself anonymous. He'll only say the sons of Zebedee, or he'll only say the sister of Mary, or whatever. He always says his own family members with some attribution that keeps him from naming them by name. And the only counterpoint I could find to this was that he also does this with Jesus' mom. He says I don't remember what he calls her. But then I found there's a passage in John where he actually has the beloved disciple adopt Jesus' mom. He says, mother, this is your son. Son, this is your mother. Okay. And then it like clicked for me. I think I even got goosebumps when I first noticed that. So no anonymous author or fake author would have put in the time to do that. That's not how people did this in the ancient world when they were pretending to write something. When you read these Gnostic Gospels, they don't keep it a secret who they're pretending to be. It's like, yeah, I'm the Apostle Thomas. I have the true message, and all the apostles before me had it wrong. Right? They're always throwing the apostles before them under the bus, these like later 2nd and 3rd century Gnostic Gospels, and they don't hide who they're pretending to be. Right? The fact the Gospel of John doesn't mention his name is not an argument against it.
But says that he's getting his information at least secondhand based on the testimony of a disciple who Jesus loved. But even if they were written by eyewitnesses, we know that eyewitness testimony is actually one of the worst forms of evidence.
This is silly because all evidence is eyewitness testimony. I mean, how do you even know you're watching a video right now? Think about it. Right? Every single thing you've ever learned has been learned through the lens of eyewitness testimony. Every single thing you've ever done, everything you've read in a book, every measurement done in a laboratory is done by a human being who's using their eyewitness testimony to learn about what they're doing. Okay, so say it's the most unreliable. Like, what are you talking about? You sound like a crazy person. This is how crazy people talk, okay?
The Innocence Project has gotten countless people off of death row who were condemned to die based on eyewitness testimony, only to be exonerated when DNA evidence proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that they...
And who was reading the DNA evidence? Eyewitnesses. This is totally goofball. So let's say that some lady's raped in the night and then she misidentifies who was attacking her. Does that mean we throw out all eyewitness testimony? Because there was this, and we're talking about crimes here, right? So it's this specific short time period where a stranger hurts a person, does something wrong, high intensity, high adrenaline situation, and then they misidentify the attacker. Does that mean that all eyewitness testimony is erroneous? No, that's so ridiculous. That's as bad as saying anything you hear secondhand is erroneous, or anything past 30 years is erroneous, right? Nothing he said so far is a good epistemic judge at all. Nothing he said so far is any kind of good argument at all. Nothing he said so far is anything that would apply anywhere else in his life aside from the Bible. This is someone who thought the Bible was totally inerrant and nothing could be changed, and he found errors in it and it broke his brain. That's what this is.
Couldn't have been the perpetrator of the crime in question. Our eyes don't function like video cameras. Our attention is selective, and so are our memories.
Yeah, but whenever a video camera records something and we watch the video, our eyes are the thing watching the video. The only reason he even knows that he's making a video right now is because he's using his eyes.
We know that people hallucinate, can develop false...
Just because someone hallucinates doesn't mean that all eyewitness testimony is bad. Would I say because people hallucinate, Holy Koolaid doesn't know if he's actually looking at his computer when he makes this video?
Memories, and that memories change over time.
Yeah, memories do change over time, but does that mean all memories are bad? If that's the case, then Holy Koolaid can't even know if he's responding to actual arguments because he can't trust his own memory whenever he's making his videos debunking things.
The texts of the Gospels were finally written down. They were recorded in Greek, but Jesus spoke Aramaic.
This, and Bart, to Holy Koolaid's credit, Bart Ehrman makes this same argument, and Bart Ehrman is actually a scholar, but it's so stupid. This is just such a dumb argument. The idea, if you're bilingual, this is totalmente estúpido. Eso no tiene ni un poco de sentido. Okay? Nobody who speaks multiple languages can take something like this.
So there's already a shift in language, which inevitably brings with it some change in meaning.
Some change in meaning. Okay. Oh my God. Yes, but that doesn't mean that you can't rely on any of it, right? That's just as stupid as an argument that's saying because something happened 30 years ago, humans are logically and metaphysically incapable of remembering it. Or because someone had any kind of persecution at all, they're totally incapable of writing down an account of what things happened. Or because it was seen with eyewitness testimony, and some eyewitness testimony is bad. You can't trust any eyewitness testimony. See how stupid these arguments are? These are terrible arguments.
We don't have any records of the original Aramaic teachings of Jesus for us to be able to verify that these early texts were an accurate translation.
Oh, God. Okay, so you have Jesus' original meaning, and he expresses that with Aramaic sound waves. Those sound waves are a sign and symbol of the actual message going on in his head. So already, anytime there's any kind of communication at all, there's always layers to it where the people who are listening, they had to listen. They had to listen to the sound waves. So that means they aren't directly connected with Jesus's message. Like, this argument is so stupid, especially if you speak multiple languages. And from what I can tell, Jesus probably spoke Greek anyway. So if he's preaching at the Decapolis, that's a Greek area. And we know that he went all over that area preaching, and he doesn't have a translator with him. We know that he grew up in Nazareth as a carpenter, and he's about 4 miles from Sepphoris, which had a bunch of earthquake damage. So he's probably over there repairing stuff. How's he working for all these Greek people if he can't even speak Greek? And in the gospel accounts, when he's dying on the cross, he says, Eloi, Eloi, sabachthani. And somebody listening, a Greek speaker, hears him and thinks he's speaking Greek and says, he's calling out for Elijah. I mean, y'all watching this on YouTube, have any of y'all ever read that in the Bible? You go, what is going on there? It's because Eloi, Eloi means my God in Aramaic, but it sounds a lot like the Greek word for Elijah. And so people who know that Jesus can speak Greek think he's speaking Greek when he says this. This is like direct evidence that people from that time and that place who are familiar with Jesus think that he's speaking Greek. Also, how is he speaking to Pilate without a translator? Pilate is a Roman official. And so some of his sermons are probably in Greek. And they have, in the same measure you use, it'll be measured against you. This all sounds like contract language. And he was probably doing contracts in Greek whenever he was working in Sepphoris. And that's even what he's talking about when he says, like a city on a hill at night, it's visible. He's probably talking about when he was a kid in Nazareth looking out 4 miles away, he would have been able to see a big city like Sepphoris lit up. Craig Evans tells us that Sepphoris was a major Greco-Roman cultural center and urban center, a large city. He says this does not mean Greek was their first language, talking about these Jews. Aramaic was, but it does mean that Greek was spoken in the time and place of Jesus, the particular time and place of Jesus. And a few scholars think that Jesus himself spoke Greek. N.T. Wright says he grew up in Galilee in the town of Nazareth, close to the major city of Sepphoris. He spoke Aramaic, some Hebrew, and probably at least some Greek.
And the gospel authors also recorded things that there's no way that they could have known, like the words and actions of Jesus when he was alone.
He always does these silly little... Let's go back to Grannie, right? So Grannie, she wasn't there whenever her father was fighting in the trenches in World War I. How does she know what he said? Right? Anything anyone has ever told you, you weren't there to see it yourself. I have... a wife who loves to play Zelda. My daughter loves to dance. Anything I tell you, you haven't seen it yourself, right?
These early texts were all handwritten, before word processors, before computers and the internet, before the printing press, and before copyright law.
I guess everything before computers, we can just throw it out. Goodbye, Plutarch. Goodbye, Suetonius. Goodbye, Livy. Goodbye, Josephus. We don't have a printing press, so that means it's metaphysically and logically impossible that anything written down could be accurate. In fact, anyone watching this video, I think you need to just take the time to get a book out and then get a piece of paper and start handwriting it and just copy it. And I want you to see how corrupted it is by the time you're done. And you'll notice that, yes, you will make mistakes. And there'll be where you skip a line or you go to one area that's the same. But it's not like it's totally corrupted beyond any kind of comprehension. I think this is a good place to pause here for a moment, and I just want to take some time. I'm going to compare P45, which is like one of our worst manuscripts, and it's pretty early, and I'm going to compare it with the Textus Receptus from the 15th century that's also a terrible manuscript. So this is two Bibles that have had 1,500 years to be screwed up and have been copied and screwed up and changed from each other. And then I want you to see me compare both of them. And the story I'm going to take from, I picked P45 because it's so bad and it's so early. And I picked this particular passage because in the previous video about textual corruption, Ali Dawa cites this verse to say that Jesus was a Muslim, that Jesus said he submits to the Father. And so I actually I found that in an early manuscript, P45, and we'll just go through it together. I'll be right back. All right, this is what scholars say about P45. It was apparent to Caldwell that the scribe of P45 copied his exemplar phrase by phrase and clause by clause, as opposed to more careful copyists who transcribed the text letter by letter as in P75. While copying phrases and clauses, he worked at reproducing what he imagined to be the thought of each phrase. Thus he transposed and omitted many words, deleting several phrases, Caldwell said. The most striking aspect of his style is its conciseness. The dispensable word is dispensed with. He omits adverbs, adjectives, nouns, participles, verbs, personal pronouns without any compensating habit of addition. Another study on P45 done by Royce affirms Caldwell's observation about the scribe's penchant for brevity. Royce comments the scribe has a marked tendency to omit portions of text, often as it seems accidentally, but perhaps also by deliberate pruning. The result of this pruning is that the scribe produced a very readable text with very little need of correction. The scribe of P45 has been characterized as producing a free text, wherein he provided an abbreviated yet readable rendition of his vorlage. And look here. This is from late second or early 3rd century. Look how much stuff there is in this, by the way. Later on in Holy Koolaid's video, he's going to say that we have almost nothing until the 4th century. That's just wrong. Obviously, he's never read P66 or P75. This is P45. It's, where is it from? Perhaps Fayum or ancient Aphroditopolis, modern Atfa in Egypt. Purchased as part of the Chester Beatty collection. Okay, so in other words, all of the scholars are like, this one's crappy. Okay, this guy leaves out stuff left and right. He tries to make stuff harmonize. So let's look at this super corrupted, very early text, and we're going to compare it with this super corrupted late text. Now, this early text is part of the Alexandrian text type from Alexandria, Egypt. That's what the text type is named after. So that's like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and P75 and P66. That's our earliest text type. And then this is the Byzantine text type. This is the Textus Receptus from the 15th century, where you've had all of the early church history, all the supposedly chaotic time where the cartoons are chasing each other in his video. Add on to that a bunch of medieval cartoons chasing each other and killing each other, a bunch of late medieval cartoons chasing and killing each other, making copies of copies of copies and totally corrupting the text. This is from the 15th century, so it's from over 1,000 years later, copied and copied and copied. When the Textus Receptus was made, I think the oldest manuscripts they had were from the 9th century. So they're from hundreds and hundreds of years after P45. Now we're going to compare P45 as it's transliterated in, what is this book called? The text of the New Testament, earliest New Testament Greek manuscripts. We're going to compare it with the Erasmian manuscript and see how many differences we find and see if the text is just totally different. Now, when I went into this, I'm not a fundamentalist. I have no dog in the fight. I don't really care. I think the resurrection happened, and I don't need the text to be super reliable to make that opinion. However, when I was doing this, I was expecting it where I would not even be able to find where in the text, like being able to compare, what part of the story I'm in one gospel with another, right? I thought it would be like things had been summarized and then they'd been expanded. This is not at all what I expected. Okay, so this is a very crappy old manuscript with a very crappy newer manuscript. Muton elakiston emo epoasite. So this starts in the middle of a verse. This is clipped off, but it's saying, the least of these to me, y'all do. So whatever it is, y'all do to me. Okay, now let's look over here on our Erasmian one. Elakiston emoi epoisate. Okay, so that's the same, identical. Tote ere, then he will say, kai toisex ionumon, those on his left, to those on his left, poriueste apemu, katrameno eis topur, go from me, you cursed ones, into the fire, toi onion, eternal, toi mas menon, prepared, to diavolo, for the devil, kai toi sangalo saltu, for the devil and his angels. Let's compare this with the Erasmian. Totere, then he will say, tois ex eunumon, to those on his left. I'll just do the English. Poriueste, go from me, you cursed ones, into the fire, the eternal, the prepared, for the devil and his angels. And I originally had a toe here because I thought that this was a problem in the manuscript. Actually, they have the dative article here. It's just written with this weird curly Q crap, so I didn't recognize it. It's actually not even a difference. This is identical. After 1,000 years, this is identical. This is the big corruption. Epenasa gar kau kedokate. So I hungered, and you didn't give moi fagain, give me anything to eat. Edipsa, kaiuk epotisateme. I thirsted, you didn't give me anything to drink. Let's compare the Erasmian. Imagine 1,000 years of Holy Koolaid's cartoons attacking each other all through the Middle Ages, all the way up into 1519 when Erasmus made the Textus Receptus, and we finally get this super corrected one. Let's see how different it is. Eprenasa gar kaiuk edokate. So I hungered, and you didn't give me anything to eat, fagain. Editsesa, I thirsted. Kaiuk epotisateme, and you didn't give me anything to drink. And look, there's this marked out chi here where I thought there was an error. Actually, the chi is written right there. It's just written with a weird, once again, curly Q. I'm just not as used to reading Erasmian Greek. So I had to go back and correct this video. There's actually less differences than I thought originally. All right, we'll continue with 43. Xenos heimin, kai u sunagagete. So I was a foreigner and you didn't attend to me, like come around me soon, like synergy together. Agete is like lead, so lead around me. Kai gumnos, and naked. I mean, kai u periebalite, and you didn't clothe me. Asthenes, kai en fulake, I was weak and in prison. Kai uk episkepsasteme, and you didn't visit me. All right, let's compare this with the Erasmian. Xenosamin, so I was a foreigner. Kai u sunagageteme, and you didn't come around me, visit me. Gumnos, naked, you didn't clothe me. Weak and in prison, and you didn't visit me. Okay, and I'm doing the best I can, okay? I'm not like a scholar. If there's anyone out there who sees something wrong with this, sees differences in these manuscripts, feel free to point it out to me in the comments, okay? My ego isn't in this. I'm a Pokemon trainer. Okay, I don't do this to try to make people think I'm cool. I know that looking at ancient Greek things online isn't cool. This is something that people with inhalers and bifocals do. This is something like Edward Andrews would do. Okay, Bart Ehrman. These aren't cool people. I know that. Okay, I'm not trying to be cool here. Tote apokrithesontai, and then they will answer kai autoi legontes, and they will say, Lord, Curie, that's the nomina sacra. Pote, when, se edomen, when did we see, penonta, hungering, deep sonta, and thirsting, exenon, these are really all ors, okay? They're not ands. Or, so when did we see you hungering, or thirsting, or foreigner, or naked, or weak, and in prison? And not serve you. Okay? 44. We get to our first difference. Then, okay, where is it? 44. Then they will respond to him. This to him is added into the Byzantine text type here, into the Textus Receptus. That to him isn't in P45. Okay? So in P45, it just says, they will respond, when did we see you weak? The big corruption here, they said, then they will respond to him. When did we see you weak? That's the big corruption. Okay? So know that is this big, imagine all the cartoons, they're all killing each other. It's chaos and we don't even know. And this is the changes you have, right? Now, there are like the three famous interpolations. You know, I don't want to downplay textual changes, right? But they're all obvious. They're all late. So I'm talking about like John 53 through the beginning of John 8, the pericope of the adulteress, the end of Mark 16, 1 John 5:7. And then there's huge differences between the Western text type and the Alexandrian text type for the book of Acts. It's about 10% longer. But if you go to just like a random passage in the Bible to see if it's totally corrupted, you find something like this is really amazingly well preserved. And on it goes. I highlighted the differences that I found, and I could do a video where I go in detail on these. I wrote them in with red here and printed it. Let me see if you can see this. But if you go through this and actually read it and take the time to read it, this is as corrupt as it gets, right? Look, this whole page has nothing but some word order differences. By the way, word order doesn't matter in Greek because you demarcate your direct object and subject and indirect object using endings, your cases. It's a declined language. And so your word order doesn't even matter. And this was a difference. Then then they plotted the leaders and the scribes and the elders. Scribes isn't in P45, but it's here in the Erasmian. So in P45, it's just everything's identical. They plotted the leaders and the elders as in P45. But this has the scribes also. So is it just the elders and the leaders, or is it the elders, the leaders, and the scribes? Oh no, I guess the Bible has been corrupted. There you go, Muslims. The Bible has been corrupted. The green I demarcated where something differs from Bruce Metzger's recreation of the New Testament, his critical New Testament, but where it's not different from P45. So there you can see word order. This hina means in order that. The in order that isn't in your P45. Altoi is a pronoun that's not necessary. This is just a spelling difference where they have an epsilon instead of an eta. And then tuto just means this. It's a demonstrative pronoun. This one word means and it's missing from P45 on this page. This is just rotted out of P45. It's not there anymore. So as you can see, this is not like something is totally corrupted beyond any kind of conceivable way to tell what the text is saying, right? I took through the time and I went all the way to the end of the manuscript for P45, and you can see these minor differences that don't really change the meaning of the text at all. That's the only thing I found on that page was just that alpha, right? Some spelling difference. So this crap is a joke. Stop making these arguments. They're stupid. They're stupid arguments. All right, let's keep going. Maybe this will get better.
Out by hand. There was no way to guarantee that someone copying your work wouldn't change it.
This is true for every single book in the entire world, all the way up until the invention of the printing press. So before 14 whatever the hell with Gutenberg, every book had this constraint.
Deliberately or by accidental copying errors. And the vast, vast majority of the population at the time were illiterate. Even of the ones who could read and write, most did so incredibly poorly, which is why when we can...
So here's the syllogism. Some people at this time period, or a lot of people at this time period, were illiterate. Therefore, the apostles could not have written these manuscripts. Well, if there's at least one hireable person in the entire ancient world that they have contact with who could write, then they could hire that person to write the story for them. So once again, this is not...
Compare ancient Greek manuscripts from this time, we see so many misspellings, accidental duplications or omissions of text, and changes to word order.
We just saw how bad it gets with P45 and the Textus Receptus of Eusebius, okay? Is that so far gone that you can't even tell what the original was saying? Like, really? That's what you think? I mean, when you lay them all out, like, oh, they're missing a pronoun here. They didn't have a dative article there. And you add it up, and then you get to the end of the book, and you go, wow, there's 5,000 variants. It's like, okay, well, if you translate into another language, there's more variants than there are words, right? Because every single word has been changed into a new language. So a variant doesn't mean a corruption. For example, see if you can tell what I'm talking about. I give my loyalty to the banner of America and the states and to the representative form of government that it supports, a single nation beneath the Almighty Creator, not able to be divided, with freedom and fair treatment for everyone. Can you tell I'm talking about the Pledge of Allegiance? Right, so I just translated the Pledge of Allegiance from English into English. So you could say there's more variations between that and the original Pledge of Allegiance than there are words in the Pledge of Allegiance. But is the whole meaning of it completely corrupted, where it's like not even recognizable anymore? I mean, maybe you didn't recognize it, but, you know, go back and replay it and think of the Pledge of Allegiance in your head watching that and go, is the whole message of this gone, right?
There were mistakes due to mishearing dictated words or due to transcribers' eyes missing a line.
This is true of every single book in the ancient world.
And that's not even counting all of the changes made out of deliberate intent. Even though we don't have that many extant texts from before the 3rd century, we know that copying errors and deliberate changes were commonplace at this time because we have at least 4 different accounts of it taking place.
Another way you could say this is, given the whole ancient world and all of history, we have 4 accounts of it happening.
Accounts from both church fathers complaining about it and by critics of Christianity calling it out. In the 2nd century, criticizing Christianity, Celsus points out,
want to hear something funny? By citing Celsus as a source, he just debunked everything he said in this video so far. Our earliest manuscript of Celsus, and our only one we have that's a complete manuscript, is from the 9th or 10th century. So it's almost 1,000 years after he wrote. And the only mention we have of him is from Origen, who's from like the middle of the 3rd century, about 100 years after Celsus. That's the only way we have Celsus's words. So remember when Holy Koolaid was saying, oh, we only have a few of these manuscripts from the 2nd century. Okay, that's a couple decades after the Gospels were written. Now he's citing an ancient source from 1,000 years after it was written, as though it's completely authoritative. And so this is totally inconsistent. When it's something against Christianity, let it in. If it's something that's for Christianity, just crank up the skepticism all the way. The other thing to note is if being an eyewitness is a problem, then what are we going to do? Because this is Celsus's eyewitness testimony. He's going around and saying all these people are changing their manuscripts and corrupting everything. Okay, well, that's eyewitness testimony. Earlier in his video, he just said eyewitness testimony is totally unreliable.
We know that eyewitness testimony is actually one of the worst forms of evidence.
And then it's also relying on Origen's eyewitness testimony, because Origen read Celsus's work and is quoting it. And so that's 2 different eyewitnesses, it's secondhand information, yada, yada, yada. And I actually believe this is Celsus's work. I'm only pointing this out because I'm pointing out how hypocritical it is, how fake it is. And atheists don't even know they're doing this because they started off as a fundamentalist, realized the world isn't 6,000 years old, and it broke their brains. And now they are incapable of seeing anything that's pro-Christianity. They have to twist and change and ad hoc their way into making the case for Christianity look as weak as possible because their brain has been broken and they feel too betrayed by the earth being 4.5 billion years old and the universe being 13.8 billion years old.
That Christians eagerly change the text of their scriptures as though in a fit of drunkenness so as to be able to defend their beliefs against criticism.
He just does the part of Origen's quote that is Celsus, but he doesn't show what Origen says about it. So I'm going to read the whole quote. After this, he says that certain of the Christian believers, like persons who in a fit of drunkenness lay violent hands upon themselves, have corrupted the gospel from its original integrity to a threefold and fourfold and manyfold degree. Some scholars also think that this might just be him referencing the fact that there's multiple gospels. Since there's fourfold, there's four gospels. I don't know. And have remodeled it so that it might be able to answer objections. Now I know of no others who've altered the gospel, save the followers of Marcion and those of Valentinus, and I think also those of Lucian. So he can only name 3 people he knows of who've purposely altered the gospel like this. But such an allegation is no charge against the Christian system, but against those who dared so to trifle with the Gospels. And as is no ground of accusation against philosophy that there exists sophists or Epicureans or Peripatetics or any others, whoever they may be, who hold false opinions, so neither is it against genuine Christianity that there are some who corrupt the gospel histories and who introduce heresies opposed to the meaning of the doctrine of Jesus. Let's note, though, that this is Celsus, right? So he hates Christianity, right? So, yeah, you might think it's accurate, but you have to realize he does have a bias. And actually, some scholars think that he's talking about Marcion in this. And Marcion's not even a Christian, at least in... It's tricky how you define Christian, but someone who believes that Jesus is God and that he's a fulfillment of promises made in the Old Testament. Like, so in that respect, he's not a Christian, right? So Marcion, he believed that you could get rid of all the passages that talked about the God of the Old Testament, all the stuff about Jesus being the Son of the Father, and he kind of made it all more Greek, kind of like how Gnostics do. He thought that Jesus was part of like the true good God who's not part of the Old Testament, kind of like Gnostics. And he gutted Luke's gospel of a bunch of stuff. But like we actually have manuscripts and pieces of manuscripts of the gospels from before the time of Celsus. And they match the ones we have today. So it's not like they're all so corrupted. That's something else to point out is like if you get a handful of people saying, these texts have been corrupted. Well, okay, let's look at each of those individual authors. Are each of one of them saying that these texts are so corrupted that we have no idea what the originals were? Or are they just saying that there's some manuscripts out there extant that are corrupted? Right? So if I took like my copy of the God Delusion, it's over there on the bed, and I took a pen and I started writing in my own stuff, is the God Delusion now corrupted? No, I don't think so.
Even the early church father Origen, despite defending Christianity against Celsus' many other criticisms, admitted elsewhere that this was a major problem, complaining that the differences among the manuscripts of the Gospels have become great, either through negligence of some copyists or through the perverse audacity of others. They either neglect to check over what they have transcribed, or in the process of checking, they lengthen or shorten as they please.
I spent hours looking for this quote in context. I couldn't find it anywhere on the internet. If anyone can find where it is, please send it to me. Yeah, so you could take any modern apologist today and take one of their quotes out of context and use that. Well, let me do this with Bart Ehrman right now, actually. You can look at all the evidence for the resurrection objectively and conclude on the basis of overwhelming proof that God really did raise Jesus from the dead. No other explanation can account for the objectively established historical data. For example, that Jesus' tomb was empty and his disciples claimed to see him afterward. See how goofy that would be if I attributed that to Bart Ehrman and I didn't tell you about any of his other beliefs, right? So when he quotes from Origen, it's not like Origen believes that the New Testament has been totally corrupted and we have no idea what the original message was. Right, he's probably looking at a bunch of manuscripts, and in a moment of frustration, he's complaining. Like, you have to think, these are real people. They actually exist in history. Fundamentalism is goofball. It's goofy. The real world doesn't work like that. When you copy something, sometimes you'll make mistakes. But the same mistake isn't going to be made by every single person copying that manuscript. And so if you compare different manuscripts from all over the ancient world, you can get back to something really, really close to the original text, as even Bart Ehrman says. For my part, however, I continue to think that even if we cannot be 100% certain about what we can attain to, we can at least be certain that all the surviving manuscripts were copied from other manuscripts, which were themselves copied from other manuscripts, and that it is at least possible to get back to the oldest and earliest stage of the manuscript tradition for each of the books of the New Testament. Let me read that last word again. It's at least possible to get back to the oldest and earliest stage of the manuscript tradition for each of the books in the New Testament. Continuing on, all our manuscripts of Galatians, for example, evidently go back to some text that was copied. All our manuscripts of John evidently go back to a version of John that included the prologue in chapter 21. And so we must rest content knowing that getting back to the earliest attainable version is the best we can do. Whether or not we have reached back to the, quote, original text, end quote. This oldest form of the text is no doubt closely, very closely related to what the author originally wrote, and so it is the basis for our interpretation of his teaching. So there you go, King Skeptic himself. We can get to something really close to what the original was.
Jerome counted how copyists would write down not what they find, but what they think is the meaning, and while they attempt to rectify the errors of others, they merely expose their own.
This doesn't even look like he's talking about all the manuscripts. It looks like he's talking specifically about the servants of a guy named Licinius who wanted some of Jerome's books. I mean, I'm not 100% sure about this reading of it, but I'm going to read it with you guys, and you guys tell me if you don't think that's what it's saying. It's letter 71 by Jerome to Licinius. He's a wealthy Spaniard of Baetica. Being much interested in the study of Scripture, he proposed to visit Bethlehem, and in AD 397 sent several scribes to transcribe for him Jerome's principal writings. So he's sending these scribes to Jerome, and Jerome's sending this letter back with the scribes. To these, on their return home, Jerome now entrusts the following letter. So we skip down to section 5, which is where Holy Koolaid quotes from. As for my poor works, which from no merits of their own, but simply from your own kindness you say that you desire to have, I have given them to your servants to transcribe. I have seen the paper copies made by them, so those scribes, and I have repeatedly ordered them to correct them by a diligent comparison with the originals. And I have repeatedly ordered them to correct them by a diligent comparison with the originals. Correct them by a diligent comparison with the originals. For so many are the pilgrims passing to and fro that I have been unable to read so many volumes. So he's saying all these pilgrims are coming to and fro and he can't read everything that they're doing. They have found me also troubled by a long illness from which this Lent I am slowly recovering as they are leaving me. If then you find errors or omissions which interfere with the sense, these you must impute not to me, but to your own servants. So he's saying it's not my fault if there's errors in these manuscripts that your servants are bringing to you. It's their fault. They are due to the ignorance or carelessness of the copyists who write down not what they find, but what they take to be the meaning, and do but expose their own mistakes when they try to correct those of others. It sounds like this group, the copyists, is talking about your own servants. Your own servants, they are due to the ignorance or carelessness of the copyists. Right? It sounds like he's talking about these servants who came to Jerome from Licinius. And he says it's a false rumor which has reached you to the effect that I've translated the books of Josephus and the volumes of the holy men of Papias and Polycarp. So these scribes that are visiting him, they're messing up manuscripts and they're spreading false rumors. I have neither the leisure nor the ability to preserve the charm of these masterpieces in another tongue. Of Origen and Didymus I have translated a few things to set before my countrymen some specimens of Greek teaching. The canon of the Hebrew verity, except the Octateuch, which I have at present in hand, I have placed at the disposal of your slaves and copyists. Once again, he's talking about Licinius' slaves and copyists. Doubtless you already possess the version from the Septuagint, which many years ago I diligently revised for the use of students. The New Testament I have restored to the authoritative form of the Greek original. How is he doing that if they're all corrupted? For as the true text of the Old Testament can only be tested by reference to the Hebrew, so the true text of the New requires for its decision an appeal to the Greek. So Jerome is telling Licinius, your copyists are screwing up manuscripts. If you want them fixed, come to me. They can be fixed and corrected. You need to compare them to the Greek originals to make sure that they're correct. How in the hell does that mean that all the manuscripts are being corrupted? That's the opposite. He's saying, come to me and it can be corrected. the correct form is still out there, and it's not like all the copyists are screwing it up, just Licinius's are. At least that's what it looks like it's saying to me.
And as early as 180 CE, the church father Irenaeus denounced the theologian Marcion as a heretic because he was tweaking and removing large sections of the gospel and Paul's epistles.
Yeah, just because a heretic exists, 100 years after Christianity has started to exist as a religion, doesn't mean that all of the texts are corrupted. I'm not even sure of the syllogism here. Marcion was screwing up scripture. Therefore, none of the manuscripts from Ephesus or Fayum, Egypt, or the Byzantine text type, or anything quoted by a church father living in France like Irenaeus, none of it can be trusted because Marcion existed. That's so stupid. That would be like if I took, it's like the God delusion example again. If I just made my own copy of the God delusion and edited out a bunch of stuff and acted like I was a new atheist, but put in all these new beliefs that Richard Dawkins didn't have, that doesn't mean that all the other manuscripts are corrupt.
In order to support his own beliefs that conflicted with those of...
In fact, it proves that Irenaeus and all these other church fathers took the original letters of these manuscripts seriously, or they wouldn't be worried about it.
Irenaeus. And this isn't a controversial thing. Even most Christian Bible scholars today will acknowledge that this was occurring at that time.
So what is it exactly that all these scholars, even the conservative ones, are agreeing on? Is it that everything is corrupted, or that Marcion was a heretic who chopped stuff out of Luke, right? So if everyone's agreeing that Marcion was a heretic who chopped stuff out of Luke, good. That's what we have evidence for. That's what the evidence is saying. If it's everything is corrupted, that's not what the evidence is saying, and it's also not what everyone else is saying. Even conservatives, really? You think the fundamentalists are out there agreeing that everything's corrupted? You think the moderates are agreeing with this? You think even Bart Ehrman, we just read a quote from him. He's saying you can get back to the oldest forms.
Like when Daniel Wallace pointed out that Revelation was copied less than any other book in the New Testament, and yet Irenaeus admits that it was already corrupted within just a few decades of the writing of the Apocalypse.
All right, to Holy Koolaid's credit here, he at least provides a citation. Unfortunately, it kind of blows up in his face. So if you actually read what he's talking about here, this is Daniel Wallace. I've never really read much Daniel Wallace. I don't trust inerrantists usually unless it's Mike Licona. I love Mike Licona. From this article, he seems pretty legitimate. But in this passage, he does talk about where Tertullian is saying in the 2nd century that they still had the autographs and that people were comparing manuscripts against the autographs to make sure that they were accurate. And he says, basically, he's not sure, but he thinks that this is probably correct. Though they don't seem to have a copy of Revelation by the time of Irenaeus. Now, when he says that Irenaeus says that the text is corrupt, he's talking specifically about whether the manuscripts have 616 or 666. That's the corruption. So if you actually look here, Irenaeus devotes an entire chapter to discussion of the variant in Revelation 13:18. He does not speak of the original text, however, but does address the earliest copies that he's seen. He compares two readings, 616 and 666, and gives the palm to 666. From the 3rd or perhaps 4th century also has the reading 616. I looked at the papyrus in 2003 while visiting Oxford. This whole thing, this is the sort of thing that an ex-fundamentalist would be worried about, or like a just total textual manuscript nerd. They freak out about little details. By comparing what he says with what Tertullian says, blah, blah, Revelation was copied less often than any other, and yet Irenaeus admits it was already corrupted within just... Yeah, so 616, 666, this doesn't really matter. Why? Well, okay, let me explain. So this is from Craig Keener, his commentary on Revelation. This is page 356. The majority of commentators find an allusion to Nero Caesar's name as written in Hebrew characters here with the 666. And archaeologists have uncovered a document from the Judean desert that spells out the name precisely this way. Interestingly, some copyists preferred for 666 the questionable reading 616, which is another way that one could count Nero Caesar. If you're doing gematria, 616 and 666 both come out to Nero Caesar if you omit a debatable letter. This change suggests that the scribes knew the tradition of the name, that the number should spell, and respelled it accordingly. So Holy Koolaid quotes Irenaeus, saying that 616 and 666 aren't the same thing, to try to argue that the whole thing is corrupted. And then it turns out 616 and 666 mean the same thing.
Pointed out that Revelation was copied less than any other book in the New Testament, and yet Irenaeus admits that it was already corrupted within just a few decades of the writing of the Apocalypse.
Yeah, it had 616 and 666. Okay.
All of this was happening. It was commonplace.
When? What decade are you talking about? What century are you even talking about? What source are you citing?
From the time that the original autographs of the New Testament books were first copied.
Okay, so the earliest source you've quoted to say that there was corruption was from 150. So that's decades without evidence, right? So there's as much evidence of corruption going on in those decades as there is of people you've killed. How do we know that Holy Koolaid didn't kill 50 babies and hide them in his house? There's no evidence he didn't, right? There's no evidence that he didn't plan to blow up an airport. There's no evidence that he didn't want to shoot a duck, or whatever it is.
And we don't have a single shred of surviving text of any New Testament book for nearly a century while all of these copying shenanigans were taking.
That's just plain false. That's just absolutely not even true. Here, even the gospel fragments he has on his little chart are from within 100 years of the Gospel of John. The text of the earliest New Testament Greek manuscripts, okay? Papyrus 1 is from the 2nd or 3rd century. Papyrus 4, Papyrus 64, Papyrus 67 are from the 2nd century. That's just within a few decades of the writing of the Gospel of John. That's not over 100 years later. Papyrus 10 is from 2nd century. Papyrus 20 from the 2nd century. James 1 from the 2nd century. Here's one from P32, might even be from the 1st century. P39 is potentially 2nd century, so within a couple decades of John. P45, which has bits of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts, is 2nd or 3rd century. P48 has Acts 23, 2nd or 3rd century. P52 has John 18. It's from somewhere between 100 and 120 AD. That could be within 20 years of the original writing of John. That's not 100 years later. And even if it was 100 years later, that's better than every other ancient book that we have. I'm going to play a clip now from a video I made earlier addressing Muslims who are making similar claims, and I'll give a little commentary on it. This isn't some Christian conspiracy. All you got to do is just Google this stuff. This is with Brave AI. Plutarch's Lives, the oldest one we have, is from 10th, 11th centuries. So that was written around the time of Jesus, and it's almost 1,000 years later. Suetonius' Lives of the 12 Caesars. Codex Memmianus is from the 9th century. So that's 900 years later, after maybe 800 years later. Oedipus Rex from Sophocles. We don't have it till the 10th century. He wrote it in like 400 BC. So that's over 1,000 years later. So this is like a clown show. When Muslims get on here and say we don't have a full manuscript of the New Testament until Codex Sinaiticus or Vaticanus, and it's 300 years after the writing of the New Testament, they look like clowns. Anyone who knows anything about ancient books and how well preserved they are laughs at how stupid this is. Like, the New Testament is worlds better than all these other things that come from the same time period. Oh, we don't even have one manuscript from within 100 years. Well, actually, we have a bunch of them, number one. Number two, no other ancient book has anything like that. Okay, if you took that same standard and applied it across the ancient world, we would have nothing. We would have nothing. We wouldn't know anything that was happening. Even if you made the standard about 500 years, okay? Most of those manuscripts are from 1,000 years later, so it's just ridiculous. It's just as goofball as the Muslims. You thought we were done with the early manuscripts, but we're not. There's way more. P69 has Luke 22. It's from the 2nd or 3rd century. All right, and he might come back, well, you can't be certain about any of those datings that they're that early because it's all probabilistic. Fine, that cuts both ways. You can't be certain that it's that late because it's probabilistic. I'm going to go with the second volume. I'll be right back. Remember, 2nd century means the 100s, okay? That's very early. P75 is from the 2nd century. P77 and P103 are from the 2nd centuries. Papyrus 87 is from the 2nd century, and that has Philemon. P90 has John 18 is from the 2nd century. Papyrus 98 is Revelation 1, and it's from the 2nd century. And I want to read to you about it because the dating of it's interesting. This is Revelation, okay? 2nd century, the reverse side of the fragment was dated 2nd century prior to discovering that a portion of Revelation was on the other side. So they found this old papyrus and they dated it to the 2nd century, the 100s, before they realized that Revelation was on the other side of it. This is from Egypt. It's housed in Cairo. It's Papyrus 98. In the first publication of this manuscript, the editor Wagner dated the manuscript, thought to be a letter with a list of objects to the 2nd century, not knowing that it was a biblical text. He chose this date because the document on the recto side, so recto verso, on the recto side of the scroll was dated to the last 1st or early 2nd century. So it's either late 1st century or early 2nd century. Later, Hagedorn discovered that what was thought to be a list of objects was actually part of the text of Revelation, chapters 1:13 to chapter 2, verse 1. Hagedorn re-edited the text, accepting the date of 2nd century as plausible, though not excluding the beginning of the 3rd century. P98 belongs to the early 2nd century, showing resemblance to P. Beryl 6849, P. Yale 171, P. Oxy 3051, and P. Oxy 5101 that was dated to the 2nd century before they even knew it was biblical. Papyrus 104 is from the 1st or 2nd century. I go to page 148. Beginning of the 2nd century, possibly the 1st century, from Aramaic, Egypt. I don't know how to pronounce that, but a bunch of manuscripts are from there. The editor, J.D. Thomas, dates this fragment to the late 2nd century while noting that the hand is indeed early. Even if it's late 2nd century, that's still probably within 100 years of John's authorship. The question is how early. The handwriting is carefully executed in what could be called the Roman unical with rounded decorated style. Papyrus 109 has John 21. It's from the 2nd century. Papyrus 118 has Romans 15 and 16. It's from the 2nd century. P137 has Mark 1. It's from the 2nd century. P. Origenicus 405 has Matthew 3 from the 2nd century. Egerton 2 is some unknown gospel. There's a blip from it that's from the 2nd century. P. Egerton 3 is from the 2nd century. It has a bunch of different allusions to different gospels. Acts 5, 2nd century. Middle of the 2nd century, similar to P4, P64, P67, P-Oxy 661, P-Oxy 2404, earliest parchment manuscript of the New Testament. Provenance unknown. Salonius, the original editor of this manuscript, dated it to the 4th century. C.H. Roberts redated to the 2nd or 3rd century. Allen accepted this date. Indeed, the handwriting is much earlier than the 4th century. The finely executed hand bears resemblance to 2nd century manuscripts such as P4, P64, P67, P-Oxy 661, and P-Oxy 2404. But 0189 is later in overall appearance, especially the small Omicron. So the Omicrons got smaller later on. Yeah, so you can see that there's plenty of manuscripts close, but even if there weren't, even if our earliest manuscript of the New Testament was from 1,000 years after the original composition, that's not proof that it was corrupted.
Place. It's not until the 2nd century that we get our first sliver of New Testament papyrus, which has survived to this day.
He says it like there's only one from the 2nd century. I just went through a giant list of them. And you know what else is stupid here? Actually, let me let him play his little ironic.
P52. It contains a fragment of a few verses and is about the size of a credit card.
That's all there is?
Okay, whenever you have like a tiny piece of something, it's not like the original scribe ripped out a piece of manuscript and wrote just that one piece. You can set that into the Greek manuscript that we have and see exactly how long the lines are, and everything matches up, and it looks just like all the manuscripts that we have now. I won't say all, because anytime you say all, people attack you. But basically, the text, the critical Greek text that we have today, you can tell. I mean, how were they able to tell that this is from the Gospel of John if it's totally corrupted? Right? You can look at it. You can look at just a handful of words and be able to tell what book it's from, because it's not just corrupted beyond all measure. And it wasn't like just this one particular page was written. So you know that the whole rest of the gospel existed at this time.
This process of hand copying and altering the text continued for another century.
Yeah, just like every other ancient book. Every ancient book does.
Still with barely any surviving texts.
I just went through a whole bunch of them looking at these books. Okay, just go order these. We don't have to sit here and make stuff up. Just get the text of the earliest New Testament Greek manuscript. Okay, volume 1 and 2 by Philip Wesley Comfort and David P. Barrett. Okay, just go get it. Go get a book.
The only extant New Testament manuscripts that we have from this period are a handful of papyrus scraps.
Not true. Papyrus 66 is almost all of the Gospel of John. Papyrus 45 is big chunks of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Papyrus 75 is a giant chunk of Luke and John. Like, John's awesome. I love John. It's my favorite Gospel. And you could get, like, most of it from Papyrus 66 alone. And Papyrus 75 matches Vaticanus really, really closely.
In fact, almost all of our New Testament manuscripts come from after the 2nd century. Papyrus.
Well, what is he expecting? For most of them to come from before the 2nd century? Do manuscripts opposite rot? Is this opposite world where things get more rejuvenated the older they are? That makes no sense. So as the gospel's spreading out further and further, and papyrus is rotting over time, are we supposed to expect more papyruses earlier in time?
Papyrus doesn't tend to survive long, especially in wet or humid climates, and for the first few hundred years, Christianity faced censorship and persecution, both from the Roman Empire and from Christians accusing each other of heresy while fighting over doctrine.
There is no evidence that the Christians were burning each other's manuscripts in the 1st century. As for the 2nd century, he's provided no evidence that that's happening. He's just saying that it happened, but none of the quotes that he gave us is showing that everyone's burning everyone's manuscripts. So if he's getting this conclusion from somewhere, he needs to put it in his video so that I can address it. But I don't even know what he's talking about.
Many Christian texts were gathered up and deliberately destroyed.
Yeah, no citation again. Who's destroying what texts? What texts are they? Which texts are they? Who's destroying them? When is this happening?
And I cannot stress enough that there wasn't just one Christianity.
And I cannot stress enough just how irrelevant this is. Whether there's Catholics and Protestants doesn't mean that the Bible's been corrupted over time.
Consider as the Bible wasn't fixed upon for the first few hundred years of the early church. There were countless versions of...
He says that it wasn't fixed what the Bible was in the early years of the Christian church. I want to look at 3 different earliest canon lists that we have. All 3 of these date from before the Council of Nicaea. The Murderari fragment, this is from the mid-2nd century. They accepted Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, 1 John, 2, 3 John, Jude, Revelation, Wisdom of Solomon. They disputed Apocalypse of Peter, rejected Laodiceans, Alexandrians, and Shepherd of Hermas. Codex Claromontanus, late 3rd century, Egypt and North Africa. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. They disputed those ones. Eusebius's church history. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, 1 Peter, 1 John, Revelation. Notice how similar those are. Those are pretty darn similar. These are from centuries apart. One's from Rome, one's from Egypt, and one's from Palestine.
Versions of Christianity and a plethora of other Gospels, Acts, Epistles.
Look at, he just puts all of these Gospels together and pays no attention to historical context. Like, when I saw Gospel of Barnabas, I burst out laughing the first time I watched this. The Gospel of Barnabas was written by Muslims. It's written in, like, the 7th century. He's just paying no attention to history. He's paying no attention to having anything to do with whatever was happening in the early centuries of Christianity. All of these are from the 2nd century or later. The only one I could see that's actually legitimate is the Egerton Gospel, and it's just a tiny piece of it that we have. And it's like a couple scraps, and there's nothing in it that looks like it's against Orthodox Christianity. In fact, I'll read it for you. Let's just read it. We'll read the one document that's actually has something to do with the origins of Christianity. Okay, this is all we have left of this thing. It's just a fragment. To the lawyers, all the wrongdoers, and not me. How does he do it? Then he turned to the rulers of the people and made this statement. Search the scriptures. You think you have life in them. They testify about me. Don't think I've come to accuse you before my Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you hope. Okay, so if anything, this is just independent, multiple attestation for things that happen in the Gospel of John. This makes the Gospel of John look more correct and more historical. But they said, we know well God spoke to Moses, but you, we don't know where you're from. Jesus told them in reply, now you stand accused because you don't believe those who've been approved by him. Because if you believed Moses, you'd believe me. For he wrote about me to your ancestors. This confirms independently all the times in the other Gospels where Jesus asserts that he's predicted in the Scriptures. Stones gathered together so they could stone him, and the rulers laid their hands on him so that they might seize him and deliver him to the crowd. But they could not seize him because the hour of his arrest had not yet come. So here we go. It's predicted that he's going to be persecuted by the leaders in some way. Okay, we can't tell that it's the crucifixion from this, but everything about this just confirms all of our other Gospels. So the Lord escaped from their hands and withdrew from them. That sounds like that passage in Luke where he escapes. And look, someone with leprosy approached him and he said, Teacher Jesus, while I was traveling with others who had leprosy and eating at an inn with them, I contracted leprosy myself. But if you want to, you can cure me. Now the Lord said to him, look, Lord, he's called Lord. That's high Christology from this independent gospel. Said to him, I want to be cured. And immediately the leprosy left him. Independent corroboration that he's able to cure lepers. Then Jesus told him, go and show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses ordered for your cure, and don't sin anymore. This is almost identical to another story in the Synoptic Gospels. Okay, here's fragment 2, recto side. To him, examining him to test him, Teacher Jesus, we know that you've come from God. So look, the teachers, they're trying to test him just like they do in the other Gospels. Because the things you do testify above and beyond all the prophets. So tell us, is it right to give kings what belong to them? Should we pay them or not? This sounds like, should we give unto Caesar what is Caesar's? Or you should give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. But since Jesus knew what they were thinking, so he's able to read minds in this, just like in the Synoptics and in John. He scolded them and asked them, why do you pay me lip service as a teacher, but don't do what I say? So he speaks with authority here. Isaiah accurately prophesied about you when he said, these people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They worship me pointlessly, blah, blah, blah. So just like in the Synoptics and John, you can tell that Isaiah is one of his favorite books because he quotes it all the time. Enclosed in the place, being subjected uncertainly, its weight unweighed. But while they were puzzled as to his strange question, Jesus walked and stood on the bank of the Jordan River, and reaching out with his right hand, he sowed on the something, and then something, water, the something, he produced fruit. So they could tell it's some sort of miracle that happened. And this is independent affirmation of what's said at the end of the Gospel of John, where it says there's even more miracles that he did that aren't recorded. So that's it. That's the big spooky Egerton papyrus. It's just affirming a bunch of things that are in our Gospels that survive until today.
And apocalypses deemed by
a lot of these are actually Orthodox writings. So, like, if you look at these, made me laugh too. Like the writings of Ignatius and Polycarp. Everything they have to say is going to be totally in conformity with modern Christianity. And these were accepted by Scripture, as Scripture by some early churches, but they were later rejected because these people weren't apostles, even though they weren't even saying anything wrong. These are all just
some churches as Holy Scripture and by others as heresy. Which books were considered canonical changed from one region to the next, and
as we looked at earlier, the list, they all had the Gospels, they all had Acts, they all had Paul's epistles, most of them had Hebrews. There's even in P45, let me find it, other books were found with that manuscript at that abbey, and so we can get an idea of what they prioritized. And I think that's from the 2nd century. Let me see. Late 2nd or early 3rd century, they had Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. Along with it, they had a copy of Genesis, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Ezekiel, Esther, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ecclesiasticus, 3 Greek New Testament manuscripts said to be found in the Coptic graveyard were the earliest manuscripts to contain large portions of the New Testament text. The first manuscript, P45, is a codex of the 4 Gospels and Acts. The second, P46, is a codex of Pauline epistles. And the third, P47, is a codex of Revelation. The 12th manuscript preserved Enoch, Melito, and apocryphal Ezekiel. Okay, so you can see a huge amount of overlap between these things. And all of my batteries are dead from my cameras. Such a brilliant mind, writing books, always learning more. Such a brilliant mind, writing books, always learning more. Mike, woo! Mike Lacona.